In this episode of Let's Talk, Bernard Conlon talks about his experience of seeing the changes in the EU over the last 30 years. We've gone through quite a few sort of changes over the last 20 years. We've had the Celtic Tiger, its rise and its fall, and the crash of 2008, and now we're into kind of Brexit. So how have you seen that evolve?
Well, I can only say I see myself as a sort of Lucky Jim character, because as somebody who's interested in history, and getting a job in Brussels in June 1986 and working for 3 years with Alfredo Sarrage, who was the person who owned the publishing company. I had a ringside seat, and after I worked with Alfredo in 1989, I went self-employed. I became independent. I became an independent journalist and consultant. I was also involved, you know, as a sideline activity. I was involved in a cultural and information platform, but I had a ringside seat to all that was going on in Brussels, and I was actually writing about a lot of these things, basically from the mid-80s and right through the 90s. There was a whole sequence of treaties and staging posts that the European Union went through. And basically, the European Union, it was called the European when the UK and Ireland joined Europe. It was called the European Economic Community, and then that became the European Community. Eventually, that became the European Union, and all those name changes and all of that were related to various treaties that were staging posts. And there was a sequence of treaties right through the 80s, the latter part of the 80s and the 90s. Amsterdam, Maastricht, Nice. These were all events that fundamentally, I suppose, upgraded or evolved what the European Union had been. I mean, after the Second World War, the European community, the European project was essentially a peace process based on economic cooperation. The European Steel and Coal Community, the Euratom, the Atomic Energy Organization. This economic cooperation was seen as a way of fostering cooperation between European countries that prevent them ever going back to war together, and it was actually very successful. But by the 1980s, when you start that process, you generate dynamic and you generate ambition. And if you create institutions within institutions, you create dynamic and ambition. And by the mid-1980s, both on the political level, there were a lot of politicians in the 1980s, people like Mitterrand, the French president, Kohl, the German chancellor. They started to develop quite a large vision of a very large, integrated, united Europe that was possibly going a little bit ahead of the population as a whole. And also the institutions. When you create institutions, if you give an institution responsibility and some power, the dynamic that's created is that they want more power and they want more responsibility, and the people at the top of those institutions generate something that may be called empire building. I think it's almost an inevitable political consequence. So by the mid-1980s, this evolution process had really built up speed. In 1992, the European single market was created. And so all these things were happening rather rapidly. And every year or two, there was a new treaty which was given the European, what was the European Economic Community, which became the European Community and eventually ended up as the European Union, more and more power, more and more competence. And so the people of Europe were aware of this European project, but they didn't really understand it all that much. And it was becoming more and more important, and more legislation at a national or member state level was being created at the European level and then integrated into the legislation of at the national level and the member state level. So I think almost by default, a lot of our legislation was coming from this huge process in Europe, and Brussels was I suppose the city that symbolised that, because a lot of the institutions were based there. So yes, there was an awful lot of change. And then of course you had the cataclysmic change, the end of the Cold War, Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. Nobody really predicted things like that. I mean, how could you? History sometimes just happens, and things happen. I'll not use the Americanism for that, but after the Berlin came down, the Berlin Wall came down, you had a lot of the former Soviet Union satellite countries who had virtually acquired their independence overnight. They had been subject to Russian influence and Soviet influence since the end of the war, because they had been liberated by the Soviet Union after the Second World War, and that was a bloc that I suppose divided Europe. And then suddenly, after 1989, that was gone, and you had all of these formerly dependent countries of the Soviet Union, were free to do what they wanted, and the European Union, on its part, was in the institutions. There was a kind of an expansionist vision at the same time, and so the idea of bringing them into the European Union fold evolved, and then of course the single currency. You got the single currency that came in the early 2000s, the enlargement with a big tranche of Eastern European and Central European countries came in 2004, and then around about 2007 Romania and Bulgaria came in, and the most recent Eastern Central European country to come in is Croatia.
Which in itself was quite interesting, because in the early 90s, Yugoslavia then splintered into its separate sort of components.
Correct.
And so a lot of the countries that were then coming into the EU had gone through certain types of trauma.
They had gone through trauma. They had economies that were very different. The societies and economies of the Eastern Central European countries was very different. You had a command economy in the Soviet Union, essentially, in very basic terms, a socialist economy, but it was a very command-led, it was a non-market economy. It had good and bad aspects, but it was very different from the Western liberal democratic political systems of Western Europe, which the European Union was a major factor. So you had two economies and two societies in the two parts of Europe that were fundamentally different. And then suddenly they were almost like in a shotgun marriage brought together. And that generated all sorts of forces and dynamics. And of course, you had the financial crisis in 2008. And because of the enlargement of the European Union, there was free movement of people from one part, the former Soviet Union part of the Europe, into parts of Western Europe and the European Union. And that, had an impact, and it's an impact that's still playing out, and that has had an influence on our politics. The financial crisis, as you mentioned, was a major staging post. The Celtic Tiger in the Irish context collapsed as a result of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And then you, in more recent times, in the UK context, we have Brexit, which is a decision by the British electorate to leave the European Union. And that just didn't happen on its own. That Brexit was influenced and had its origins in events that happened earlier in the new millennium. All of these events fed into that. So they're all interrelated.
We have more on the way, so please subscribe to this channel and check out the link below if you'd consider becoming a patron to help us keep making more content. Thanks for watching.